All right, if I could have your attention, please. Thank you. Before I begin my lecture for today, I just want to make a few announcements. My office hours, you might want to write them down. They're just a little bit different than what I mentioned on the syllabus. It's just a slight change. But the office hours are Tuesdays, 1:30 to 3:30, and on Thursdays from 10:15 to 10:45. Usually after class finishes, I usually go to my office or I go have lunch. I mean, you could catch me right after if you don't have a class. And sometimes we might even actually go for lunch or something. That's a possibility. So, but if you want to come see me explicitly in my office and a time when I'm going to be there, those are the office hours that I've mentioned to you. Secondly, I mentioned to you a list of films, and I was actually reading from a earlier copy. So some of you probably noticed that the version on the net, the syllabus that you have on the net, which is the updated version, and that's going to be further updated, as I mentioned to you in my previous class. So the last time it's going to be updated is going to be sometime either tomorrow or over the weekend, but by Monday morning it's going to be the absolutely final syllabus that you'll have. But the list of films that was given to you is a bit shorter than what is actually mentioned there. So, a couple of you had come asking me if you could write on Bend It Like Beckham, and indeed you can. All right, so the list that is actually mentioned on the syllabus online is the list that you should go by. And as I've already mentioned to you, there will be a couple of substitutions, a couple of readings are going to be changed, and you're going to have new readings in their place. But by Monday morning, if not by tomorrow evening, you should have the final syllabus. All right. Now, what I'm going to do today, so you have 3 short readings for this week, and one of those readings is a kind of a longer piece which kind of lays out some of the themes that have traditionally been used to study the diasporic Indian diasporic context, the nature of the Indian diaspora. So this is a piece by Colin, Clark, Peach, and Vertovec, themes in the study of the South Asian diaspora. There's a lot of detail there. And just a little tip there, that some of this detail, I mean, you obviously need to read the pieces, but some of that detail, you don't obviously need to bother with it. You read it and you're not expected to obviously remember it. For example, the profuse detail that you'll find very often about the languages used in the Indian diaspora, which is an important issue, like many others, and like many others, it may not receive enough attention since we are interested in the broader picture. What I want to do is I want to give you a conceptual framework which has some overlap with the conceptual framework given in this particular piece, but I want to suggest to you 3 or 4 different items that you need to be thinking about. And so the first thing that I'm going to begin with is just some indication of demography, some indication of the size of the Indian diaspora, right? And also some tips on why perhaps this fixation with numbers may not be the best way to try to understand what is the nature of this Indian diaspora. So if you look at the figures that are given in the Vertovec piece, and he's drawing upon data which goes back to 1987, right? So now obviously this is, we're talking about 25 years after the fact. This is the second page of that article which you have for your first week's reading, where the total number of South Asians given in the United Kingdom is listed as 1,260,000. Now, just for your information, in the UK census of 2011, it lists 4,214,000 South Asians, right? Of which approximately the Indians constitute approximately a third of that total, right? A third of that total. And then the Pakistanis are about, another, a little bit less than a third, and then the Bangladeshis are going to be less than 1 million. So if you're taking the 4.2 billion, we're talking about Bangladeshis constituting slightly less than 1% of the total population of Britain, right? The Pakistanis constituting 2% of the total population of Britain, and Indians constituting 2.5% of the total population of Britain. So South Asians as a whole constitute 7.5% of the total population of Britain. Now that's far in excess of the total South Asian population in the United States, which would be something on the order of about 1.5%. Right? The Indians are approximately 1% of the population of the United States, and then if you add the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, that's going to be another half of 1%. Yes? The UK census or the US? I'm actually giving you 2011 figures from both. Yeah, right? So, very contemporary figures. Right, so the Vertovec, he gives a grand total of about 8.6 million Indians living outside India, excluding Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, right? Sri Lanka, excluding South Asia, which is a complicated set of figures there. The Indian population of Pakistan has declined very considerably at the time of partition, that is in 1947, when India was bifurcated, as some of you surely know. At that point, Indians constituted roughly 10% of the population. That is after things had settled down, because things were in a flux at the time of migration, but shortly thereafter, when things settled down, Indians constituted roughly 10% of the population of Pakistan. Today, that population is down to about 1 to 1.5%, right? But nonetheless, it's still a significant figure. And then, of course, in Bangladesh, the population of Indians is roughly about 10%. All right. So we are excluding South Asians living in the rest of South Asia. Okay, Indians living in the rest of South Asia from these diasporic figures. Now, again, if you look at Vertovec's figures, the United States, this is 1987 figures. He mentions 500,000 Indians. And we know that today the figure is closer to 3.15 million. Right? So if you had to take a rough count, we're saying probably 20 to 22 million people of Indian origin living outside South Asia. Okay? Living outside India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all of that. Right? Roughly. Now, this is where one can complicate it in interesting ways. And you might think this is a far-fetched way to try to do it, but I want to at least give you an illustration of why I think we need to think a bit more imaginatively about what it means to speak about a diaspora. Because we're still rooted to some kind of geographical determinism here, by which I mean that we're saying that, well, one way to count the diaspora is to just do a body count and say, okay, there are 3 million Indians living here, there's so many million Indians living in Britain, so many living in Canada, Australia, so forth and so on. Now, in New Delhi, right, the city where I come from, you have a considerable middle class, as you do in all Indian metros, all right, the huge metropolitan centers of India, which would include Mumbai, also known as Bombay, Madras, now known as Chennai, and then Calcutta, Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and so on. Right? And when I'm speaking of these metros, I'm speaking of some of the biggest metros in the world, because Delhi and Bombay are among the 10 largest cities in the world today. And each of them has roughly a population approximating 20 million. Right? Now, if you look at the metros and if you look at India as a whole, the estimate is that the middle class, okay, and this is going to sound like a strange estimate because you'll see the range. Estimate is that middle class numbers anywhere from 150 million to 350 million. And that's not much of an estimate, frankly. I mean, if the gap is 200 million, right, what kind of estimate is that? But one of the problems with arriving at an estimate is that the idea of the middle class is notoriously slippery. It's a very elastic concept. What is a middle class? Right? How do you define a middle class? Is it simply those who are not lower class and upper class? Right? That is simply by exclusion. Right? Is it people who engage in certain levels of consumption? Now, if you go by that, frankly, most of the people who are middle class in India would be considered poor here. Most of them. Okay? Because the levels of consumption in the US are still extraordinarily higher than they are, right, in India, and in fact in most of the world. Most recent estimates suggest that an American child consumes 30 times as much energy, for example, and water as a child growing up in India or Somalia or Sudan or wherever. At least 30 times as much. Okay? 30 times as much resources. Right? So you can see that when we say middle class, well, what do we mean? right, by this idea of a middle class. So now let me cut to the chase. Let me get to the point that I want to make, which is that let's take the lower end of this estimate and say 150 million people belong to the middle class. Now, frankly, if you ask me, I would say that at least 3/4 of them would rather be living in the US rather than in India. And in my book, The Other Indians, which you're going to be reading sometime during the 4th or 5th week, in the last chapter, I suggest that the Indian diaspora is actually about 200 million, because those Indians who belong to the middle class, who are living in Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta or wherever else, in some ways they're already living in the US. Mentally, they're living in the US. They're all being prepped up. You know, the school my children went to, okay? You know, 11th grade, they start taking the SAT. Well, what are they doing taking the SAT living in India, right? And they'll receive catalogs from Harvard and Princeton and Berkeley and Swarthmore, Amherst, UCLA, you name it, right? They have a more intimate familiarity with American culture than they do with Indian culture, a good many of them. Their favorite foods are not dal and roti, but pasta or pizza. Right? That's what we're talking about. These people are already part of the diaspora, frankly, because mentally they are now inhabiting a different world. Right? So this is what I mean when I say that I think we're going to have to try to understand whether we can give a bit more elasticity to this idea of the diaspora. Because after all, when we speak of the diaspora, we're also speaking about a diasporic imagination that is at work here. You know? In some ways, these people actually would rather be living there. It's quite ironic, by the way, that, I mean, and you'll get a better sense of that when we move into weeks 4, 5, 6, that many of the Indians here, you know, they are much more deeply rooted in something called Indian culture than many of the upper middle class Indians living back in India who don't have the remotest interest in something called Indian culture. But here they do. And their daughters are learning Bharatanatyam. I'm absolutely certain that half of the Indian women in this country, you know, who are going through school and, you know, are teens are learning Bharatanatyam. Half of them. Or if not Bharatanatyam, then some other dance form called Kathak or Odissi, but usually it's Bharatanatyam, right? And they're addicted to Hindi films, many of them, which is not the case, frankly, with many of their peers in that class group back in India itself. So forth and so on. One could go on in this way for quite a while. But I hope you understand what I'm trying to convey. All right? So this is now some demography. Now we get to usage. Right? What word should we use to describe these South Asians in America? Among scholars and activists on the left, they like to use the word desi. Okay, do we have any chalk here? Yeah, all right. Okay, so they like to use the word desi. One advantage of using the word desi, let me tell you where the word desi comes from. It comes from the word desh in Hindi, which means country, as in one's own country. So, for example, Swadesh, Swadeshi, right? There was a movement, a nationalist movement, anti-colonial movement in India, and one of its planks was what was called Swadeshi. So Swa is a prefix, Sanskrit prefix, which means one's own. And then Desh means one's own country. So to be Swadeshi meant you bought Indian things. You didn't buy overseas things, right? You partook of Indian culture. So Desi means one's own people, right? And one of the reasons why the left, people on the left in particular like to use it is because Desi really includes all South Asians. It includes Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and Nepalis, maybe Sri Lankans. That's a little bit iffy. We won't get into the details of that, but certainly Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Indians, you know, they're all Desi, right? So you partake of a certain culture. Now, the history of Pakistanis, frankly, in some respects, is very different than the history of Indians. Britain is the best example of that. The US is not perhaps the best example of that. Britain is the best example. One of the pieces that I'm going to show you later on, you'll see it in a PowerPoint, a newspaper article which came out about 15 years ago, and it's called The Patel versus Rasool Divide in Britain. right? So Patel is a typical Gujarati Hindu name, and Rasul would be a Muslim name. Okay, so this is what the article was called, because what the article pointed to was the fact that the trajectory of Pakistanis in Britain was extremely different from the trajectory of Indians. The Indians had become very successful. And particularly in Britain after 9/11, the Pakistanis, predominantly Muslim. So if you look at, that's another big distinction between the Indian and the Pakistani community in Great Britain. The Pakistani community, like the Bangladeshi community, is predominantly Muslim, over 92% Muslim. If you look at the Indian community in Britain, it's slightly more than half is Hindu, 30% is Sikh, okay? And then about 15 to 16% is Muslim. Okay? So big difference, but the sharpest point of difference is the economic divide, that the Indians have done much better than have the Pakistanis. And of course some people will ask, well, does religion have a role to play in that or not? We're not going to try to assess that at this point, right? You know, so is the level of integration of Indians much greater than the level of integration of Pakistanis into that culture? We find that the rate of intermarriage between Indians and white people, whether white men or white women, is much greater than the rate of intermarriage between Pakistanis and white people. All right? So when you aggregate all of these people into a category called Desi, it's obviously going to obscure some things as well. And I'm not saying, by the way, that there may not be some merit. The merit might be that if you want to forge some kind of solidarity, then you want to use the word Desi, right? If you want to say that, look, I mean, the divide between India and Pakistan itself was an artificial divide, a construct of history, a construct of a consequence of colonialism, and at least living overseas, we shouldn't be divided. However divided we may be back in India and Pakistan itself, that might be one merit in using the word Desi, but then there are disadvantages as well, right? Interestingly, the word Asian, need to say something about that, because this word Asian has two completely different histories in the US and in Britain. So when you say Asian in Britain, it almost invariably means South Asian. It does not mean Chinese, or Vietnamese, or Korean, or Japanese, or Filipino, etc. Right? Asian in Britain means South Asian, and that means Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. Right? And if you look actually at the British census, right, so they divide it according to different groups and ages, and you know, of course, they give you the gender breakdown, right? But I'm talking about the detailed charts that you get, right? The division is, so you get whites, then you get Asians, and you get Africans and Caribbeans, okay? And recently they've introduced Chinese and others. Now, of course, in the United States, it's the opposite history, because in the US, Asian really meant people from the Far East, and that meant China, Japan, Korea, you know, and Filipino. South Asians were typically not included. For those of you, and I know that there are, you know, a dozen or so of you from Asian American studies, you know, you would certainly be familiar with the fact that Asian American studies, if you look at that concept and you look at its history, frankly, South Asians were not part of that 20, 30 years ago. It's only recently now that South Asians have become, okay, included. It's become a more inclusive category, Asian Americans. But typically, Asian in the US actually meant something quite different than what it meant in Britain. So if you say history of Asians, that we're doing, it's again a term that will mean quite different things. Right? And for our purposes, and that's what I decided in my book, I mean, there is when you read the book, you'll see that there is a little note where I explain what are the politics of using different categories. But I do think that Indian Americans is probably still the most reasonable category that we can try to use. All right, now let me get to, now that we've dispensed with, you know, the question of usage, terminology, and demography, let me get to roughly 4 broad themes for today. which sort of provide the conceptual framework. And as I said, there's some overlap with the conceptual framework in one of the readings, but some difference as well, right? The first thing we can think about is waves or streams of migration, right? And we'd have to go back, by the way, to remote antiquity, just to give you a brief idea. Obviously, we're not going to spend much time on that. But the reason it's important to just give you some idea about what was happening in remote antiquity, that is, with the idea of Indians moving, right? That idea is important to think about, because during the colonial period, there came about a perception which the colonial state and its functionaries tried to ensure would be widely accepted. And that idea was that Indians are a highly static people, stagnant. That they echo their civilization is stagnant, it hasn't developed over a very long period of time, and Indians themselves don't actually move around. There would be a miracle to think that an Indian would go even 20, 30 miles beyond his birthplace in his lifetime. This was an idea that became very widespread in the colonial period. Now, what we do know, in fact, is that Indians have been extremely mobile for a very long period of time. How did Buddhism, for example, travel? Buddhism originated in India, right? How did it travel to Southeast Asia? I mean, virtually all of Southeast Asia became Buddhist at one point. Now, that history has changed over a period of time. Even Islam, by the way, came to Southeast Asia. For those of you who know anything about Indonesia, for example, if you don't, it doesn't really matter, but Indonesia, as you know, is a vast country, one of the largest populations in the world, and predominantly Muslim, over 98% Muslim, right? Except when you go to Bali, where there's Hinduism. But if you go to Java, which is a huge island and which has over 100 million people, the population of Java is virtually entirely Muslim, except for small pockets, a few thousand Hindus here and there, a few thousand Christians, so forth and so on, right? And Islam came to Indonesia not from Arabia. It came to Indonesia from India. From India. Right? In fact, every religion that came into Indonesia, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all came from India. So we're talking about the transmission of Buddhism, which meant that there were obviously people moving from India to other parts of the world. Another way to look at it, and this will give us a longer time span now, and that is what is called the Indian Ocean trading world. Right? That from roughly a little bit after the beginning of the Christian era, or the Common Era, right? So let's say the 2nd century of the Common Era, 2nd century AD, all the way until the 14th, 15th centuries, one of the most dominant facts of world history at that time was what is called the Indian Ocean trading system. Right? So if you look at the Indian Ocean trading system, this is obviously an extremely rough map here. So this is India here, and then over here is going to be, the Gulf, right? The Persian Gulf, and Africa over here, landmass here, and this is going to be Southeast, this is Ceylon over here, and then you've got Southeast Asia over here. You had an extensive trading network, okay? Extensive trading network going all the way to the east coast of Africa. I mean, there seems to be some evidence of settled Indian communities on the east coast of Africa going back to perhaps as far back as 500 BCE. Possibly 500 BCE, but certainly the beginning of the Common Era. Right? So we're talking about roughly 2,000 years ago. This is part of what is called the Indian Ocean trading system. At some point I'll show you a more formal map of that and you'll get some idea, right, of what the system was like. So what we're suggesting here is that there has always been a considerable amount of mobility. And if you read records from the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, right, you couldn't go to a single place in this entire area, to Aden, to Ethiopia, to the Malay archipelago. You couldn't go to any one of these places and not run into a Gujarati. They were all over the place. So the Gujaratis who's now going to be found in Cerritos and Artesia, it's a long history, a very long history. The Patels have been around, going around for a very long period of time. Okay? Highly mobile community, trading community for the most part, entrepreneurs, right? And this is important because it gives you some sense of what kind of mobility they had, right? Are these people who feel that they can adapt better than other ethnic communities or linguistic communities in India? All right? Then what we also have, so the second phase of that, if I want to put it that way, so I'm talking about first the transmission of Buddhism and then the Indian Ocean Trading Network, and then we can also talk about, some of it is related to that, we can talk about the Indianization of Southeast Asia, all of Southeast Asia. You know, the Malay archipelago, the Indonesian archipelago, Vietnam. If you look at southern Vietnam, the dominant kingdom was a Champa kingdom, an Indian kingdom. Right? And again, a very complicated set of hypotheses have developed around how this happened, but it's very clear that large chunks of Southeast Asia came under the influence of India. And you had the transmission of Hinduism. If you go to Java, there's a place called Prambanan. Okay? Prambanan is a temple complex, and this temple complex is in Java. Prambanan. It's a Hindu temple complex, a huge Hindu temple complex, dating to about 1000 AD. Borobudur, World Heritage Site, a major Buddhist site, one of the major Buddhist stupas in the world. Right? These are all marks of the Indianization of Southeast Asia. And of course, it's transparent in the language. By the way, the word Indonesia comes from the word India. It means greater India. You know? Right? So, this is something that you can look into yourself, but if we are speaking about the Indianization of Southeast Asia, right, we're obviously speaking about not simply the fact that the courts were under the influence of Hindu kings or Buddhist kings, as the case might be, but that there were a large number of people, some of them traders perhaps, right, maybe some priests. And then who built these temples? Were these laborers who had come from India? Because when you build a Hindu temple and you carve the deities, you obviously need people who know how to carve these deities. If you look at Hindu temples in the United States, by the way, I've been to many and I'll show you slides of many of them. The people who do the carving, right, at these temples, they all come from India, the bulk of them. Certainly the major architects all come from India. So what we're suggesting here very simply is that there was an influx of Indians into Southeast Asia. Not in perhaps massive numbers, but certainly significant numbers. Right? Now moving into the modern period. So far I've identified two strands. One is the period of remote antiquity, which includes the transmission of Buddhism from India, and then the Indian Ocean Trading Network, and then secondly, what I'm calling the Indianization of Southeast Asia. A thesis that has been contested, of course, by some people who are not quite sure exactly how it took place and whose hands it took place, right? But nonetheless, there are signs of it all over Southeast Asia even today. Moving into the modern period now, we get a number of different strands of migration. Okay? The first, which was hardly ever talked about until quite recently, and now we become more aware of it. Now there are, in fact, actually a number of books that have been written on it, and you're going to be reading excerpts from one of these books, is, except that here I'm talking about much later, evidence of the movement of these peoples. I'm talking about a group of people known as Lascars. So Lascars are seamen from India. Right? You find the evidence of these Lascars in Britain, for example, going back to the early 18th century. Now, you might say, what were the conditions under which that happened? Right? The conditions under which it happened was that Britain is obviously a great naval power. Right? We know that this is how the British Empire got established largely. It got established through the British Navy. Right? Britain is a great imperial power, and many of the seamen who worked on British ships increasingly were Indians. Now, when the ship would dock, okay, at some port in Britain, these Indians would get off. Some of them would melt into the crowd. This was the era before passports, luckily. Okay? And as a little footnote, I might mention to you, in case you think that the passport is an eternal document, the passport was only invented just 125 years ago. There was no such thing called a passport, right? So for those of you who think, for example, that, hey, today we have globalization, we have the unrestricted movement of people. In fact, you could argue to the contrary, that the passport has made it virtually impossible for some people to travel. I mean, try entering the United States without a passport. Well, of course, we know there are people who are doing that from Mexico, right? You know, but try entering it, you know, if you were coming from, let's say, India. Well, you could be an Indian and then go to Mexico and then try to cross the desert in Arizona or wherever and try your luck, right? But you see what I mean, that if that the passport has become one way to regulate ingress and egress, entry and exit from a country. And there were no such regulations really before, right? So what we're saying is that these Lascars would melt into the crowd, and some of them took English women as their wives. And exactly the same thing is going to happen in Harlem. And that's a book that you're going to be reading excerpts from in the early part of the 20th century. Indian Lascars who are going to start living with Hispanic women and black women, for example, in Harlem. Right? A fascinating new book that has just come out on that, you know, very recently. Okay? Right, so you've got these Lascars coming in to these parts from the 17th century onwards. But these are scattered people, right? I mean, there's some Lascars here and there. We're not talking about a concentrated wave of people. To speak of a concentrated wave of people, we have to go to the 19th century. And this is going to be the subject of my lecture next week, my 2 lectures next week, where we're going to look at the whole system of indentured labor. But let me say a few words, because this is now part of the larger picture that I'm drawing about different waves of migration, right? Different strands of mobility that account for the Indian diaspora. So indentured labor began in 1834 and ended in 1917. Right? It lasted for approximately 8 decades. The circumstances of the origin of indentured labor have to do with the abolition of slavery, right, in British possessions in the 1830s. Britain declared an end to slavery in its possessions, right, in the 1830s. And when that was done, it immediately raised a problem. The problem was that if you had abolished slavery and you didn't have slave labor any longer, who was going to work on your plantations? So you had a plantation in Jamaica or in Barbados, right, or in Trinidad. These are all plantations owned by white men, right? You're an owner of a plantation. Once slavery has been abolished, the free black man decides to raise the cost of his labor. Because, of course, under slavery, you didn't have to worry about such things. Right? You extracted the labor, right? And if you felt generous, you provided some kind of livelihood to the slave, right? A small place to live in, you know, a couple of meals a day, right? But once slavery has been abolished and the black man and black woman decide that they're going to set a price to their labor, and you don't want to pay the price of that labor, who's going to work on your plantation? Right? This is the origins of the indentured system. India was a colony of the British by that time. So in these former British colonies, one of the things that they did was that the colonial state made an arrangement with the colonial state in Jamaica, for example, working along with the plantation owners, made an arrangement with the colonial state back in India and said, would you send some people over, okay, who can work on these plantations? And then, of course, we're going to have to ask a question, which we are not going to ask at the moment. We're going to defer it until next week. What were the circumstances under which the Indians left? Why would they leave? If you were coming from some little village in Bihar, in North India, and let's supposing that you had never gone more than 50 miles from your birthplace, right? And then suddenly you get sent off to a place called Fiji, you've never heard of, which is 10,000 miles away, or 5,000 miles away, right? Usually without your family, by the way. Right? So we'll look into that. But that's a system of Indian indentured labor, as it's called. Commenced in 1834. It was obviously onerous. One major historian, Hugh Tinker, described indenture as a new form of slavery. in effect. Right? And so by the late 19th century, there were going to be demands for its abolition. And finally, in 1917, the system of indentured labor is going to be abolished. All right? And we'll look at the figures next week. How many Indians went? Where did they go to? What was the nature of the contract? Right? So forth and so on. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, you also have another phenomenon. Since India is part of the British Empire, you have Indians who are going to be fighting colonial wars. And they're going to be fighting World War I. By the way, I don't call it World War I. I mean, I'm calling it just provisionally that, because these are all colonial wars. These are wars fought largely by European powers to establish their supremacy. Right? They're contesting for power with each other. Rest of the world is going to be drawn into these wars. What did Africa have to do with World War I? What did India have to do? These are wars fought between Germany, Britain, France, right? The major European powers who are contesting for supremacy. And because now the large part of the world is a colony of one or the other of the European powers, much of the world is going to be drawn into these wars. The consequence for us, for our purposes, what we have to think about is the fact that there were a large number of Indians who, because they were subjects of the British Empire, were drawn into these wars. Over 60,000 Indians fought in World War I. Many of them fought in Mesopotamia, Iraq, for example. Right? Some of these soldiers are going to settle down where they fight. They're going to desert, or they're going to find some other occasion to settle down wherever they've gone. It's certainly, there's an exposure to different cultures, right, as a consequence of this encounter, shall we call it. All right? And the same thing is going to happen in World War II as well. Now, if you go to the period from 1945 up till the present, we can speak about a few different strands there as well. Right? One of the major strands, by the way, that I have not mentioned to you, because it's really minuscule, and we're going to be looking at it in great detail because it's part of the history of Indians in the United States, and that is a strand of migration which is going to begin roughly around 1890, and that's Indians who start to come into North America. You know, a lot of them to Canada, to Vancouver, and then from Vancouver they're going to make their way down the coast, eventually to California. Right? A few of them are going to come to California. Many of them are going to be farmers, peasants. Some of them are going to be laborers working in the lumber yards, right? In places like Washington State, which had a huge lumber industry, of course. Some of them are going to be students. The first Indian student at UC Berkeley, for example, almost 100 years ago now, right? So there are going to be different strands, and some of them are going to be revolutionaries. But this is something we're going to look at later. But these are, again, relatively small number of Indians that we're really speaking about here, right? So we can't compare this, you know, to indentured labor, which is a huge wave. The Indians that we're talking about coming into the US in 1890, 1900, 1910, these are little rivulets, little streams, right? Now, post-World War II, much of Europe has been destroyed. They need a labor force to rebuild the economy. That's one reason why Indians are going to be imported into places like Britain, Holland, Germany. Of course, England was a bit easier because India had been part of the British Empire. It was no longer part of the British Empire because in 1947, India is going to acquire independence. And India is going to be, as you know, vivisected, bifurcated, right? Pakistan is going to be created as a new nation state to house largely the Muslim population, right? The crucial fact for us, as I said, is that once the economy starts to pick up, post-World War II recovery, the Marshall Plan, huge influx of money coming in from the Americans to rebuild Western Europe, right? Well, you need a labor force for that as well. And this is going to be the point at which Indians are going to start to go to Britain, right, and Germany, Holland. And the numbers I gave you for Britain obviously testify to the kind of presence that South Asians had. And in this case, you're speaking not only about Indians, you're also speaking about Pakistanis and Bangladeshis as well, right? Then moving a little bit beyond that, in the 1960s and 1970s, we can identify 2 or 3 different strands. And that pretty much brings us to the present day, right? So in 1965, you have the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act in the US, which is going to change the nature of immigration to the US. So you're going to have a quota system. The country is going to open itself up to people from all over the world, literally, right? And I described some of the rudiments of that. I'll describe some of this in greater detail when we come to the United States. 1965 and thereafter, initially we're speaking about graduate students coming to the US, and then once these graduate students have come and they've acquired degrees, let's say an MD or a PhD, many of them will go back. They'll usually, by the way, single male students, a vast bulk of them, single male students, at least for the first 15 years. Most of them will go back, marry, and then eventually raise a family in the United States. Then you have got this preferential system, right? So, you sponsor your sibling, right? You sponsor your brother, sister, your parents, and this is a family reunification that is part of the INS Act of 1965 and its modifications thereafter. This is also the period which is characterized by the phrase brain drain, right? The argument being that in fact the US was able to capitalize on getting professionals who had largely been educated, at least their earlier education had all been in countries such as India. So that the US, so for example, many of them were graduates of IITs. I don't know how many of you have heard of the IITs. That's the Indian Institute of Technology. By the way, it is estimated that half of the IIT graduates today are living in the United States. Half. And the IIT is a very prestigious institution. So there's a joint entrance examination. It's called the Joint Entrance Examination. Over 200,000 students sit for that examination. And you're talking about a few hundred spots at each of the IITs. I mean, it's harder to get into the IIT than it is to get into Harvard or any other place in India. Okay? Much harder. So these IIT graduates, they've already gotten a 4-year undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, you name it, physics, whatever the case might be. They're coming over then for a doctorate. Right? So this is what is being captured by the phrase brain drain. Right? And now we're not making an normative assessment. Maybe some of these people would have been misfits back in India. Maybe some of them wouldn't have had the resources anyhow to do anything there. Right? So forth and so on. We are not making a normative assessment of what this really meant for India. What we're saying is that this is how the migration of these professionals, this is what was entailed, okay, in the migration of these professionals, this so-called brain drain. Now, this brain drain, let's just provisionally continue to use that phrase, is not simply capturing Indians coming to the US and to Australia and Canada and Britain. It also captures the Indians who are going over to the Gulf countries. So that's a second strand now. The Gulf countries, a little more complicated. Picture there. How do the Gulf countries enter into the picture? You've got an oil boom in the mid-1970s. And when I speak about the Gulf countries, I'm talking about places like Dubai, of course, Abu Dhabi, right? And I'm also speaking about the states such as Kuwait, Iraq, which in the 70s, Saudi Arabia. Iraq is not the best example because Iraq had a large, considerable middle class of its own. But countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, they didn't have even institutions really of higher education. The elites there were all educated overseas to the extent that they were educated. So in places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and then in the Gulf states, you had two kinds of labor coming in. You had blue-collar laborers, because once the oil boom started, construction. I don't know if anyone of you has gone to Google. If you haven't, just do that. Okay, and just look at some pictures of Dubai. I mean, makes LA look like, a third world shack. Okay? I mean, you're talking about huge, enormous. It's like Shanghai. I don't know how many of you have been to Shanghai, but I mean, it just completely dwarfs anything you've seen, okay, in the US. And again, if you read today's New York Times article, first page, all right, a new airport in Shanghai that's been built. It's like 3 or 4 million square feet, something like that, built in 4 years from paper, from the drawing board to its eventual construction. And here they've been working on the 405 for I think about 3 years at least. You know, this little stretch, about 5 miles, right? 3 years at least I can remember, because when I'd gone to India, they already started working, and that was 3.5 years ago, right? Okay, now, I'm not saying, by the way, again, I'm not giving a normative assessment, because in China, you don't have to worry about environmental laws. You know, the state decides what it's going to do, and bang, you know, you do it, right? So I'm not saying that we should emulate that necessarily, but I'm just giving you an illustration of the kind of boom that you had. Now, this is what Dubai went through. Who put up all of these huge buildings, hospitals, you know, the roads, highways, bridges? It is a labor from South Asia. Okay? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And there again, by the way, you know, one has to be very careful that one doesn't think that it was only blue-collar workers and laborers who went. They needed a professional labor force too. That's where the brain drain, okay, is the history that is, it captures a history not only of Indians coming to the US and Britain and so on, to the industrialized north. It also captures a history of Indians going to the Gulf states, right? Because when you've built these hospitals, well, you need doctors, for example, right? So forth and so on. So you had a considerable number of professionals going to the Gulf states with very different, by the way, entitlements. But this is something we'll read about much later on, because frankly, it's almost impossible for an Indian to become a citizen in Dubai. We're going to have to completely change our understanding of what it even means to be a citizen. Okay? Who are these diasporic Indians in Dubai? What is their relationship to the state? Right? You know, what are their entitlements? A completely different narrative than what we're going to have in the US. Yeah, you had your hand up?
I was just going to ask you.
Yeah, right? So, yeah. But I'm just giving you a hint that you know, we can't make that comparison simply that way. We're going to have to look at some of the complexities of it later on. So that was my first broad theme, is this you know, waves and strands of migration. Secondly, what are the conceptual themes and processes by which one understands a diaspora? Not just the Indian diaspora, any diaspora, but we are interested, of course, primarily in the Indian diaspora. So we begin with the phenomenon of what is called migration, which is what I've really discussed up till this point in time, right? But there is a conceptual problem too in the category of immigration. You know, so if you look, for example, at American history, there used to be a historian in the 1950s. I mean, I remember reading him, not in the 50s because I wasn't born in the 50s, but I remember reading him in the late 1970s. He was still a major force in American history. I think he's largely forgotten now because the nature of the work has changed. His name is Oscar Handlin. Okay? And he wrote, his whole life's work was dedicated to the study of the immigrant in American society, because the argument was that what made America distinct was that this was a society of immigrants. Right? Now this is, I think, true, by the way, of large parts of the New World. It's true of Australia as well. The Australian Aboriginal population was virtually wiped out. I mean, it's like the Americans, the Native Americans in the US, almost wiped out. I mean, there are a few pockets left here and there, and today in dire straits, frankly, just as is the case with the Aboriginals in Australia. Right? So I don't think the US is entirely distinct in that. I think that even Argentina, for example, you know, if you look at much of South America, right? Society of immigrants, societies of immigrants. But nevertheless, of course, America captures the imagination as no other place. I mean, nobody in India is even remotely interested in thinking about Argentina or Brazil. They couldn't care less, frankly, right? But the minute you mention America, you go through the roof. Everybody's jumping up, you know, right? So in other words, America captured the idea of a society of immigrants. And that meant that, well, there was no history, apparently, right? There was a clean slate. You came here and you started life. Right? That was the narrative. I'm putting it in very crass terms because, again, we don't have the luxury of being able to examine, all of these hypotheses in great detail, and we're not really looking at Handlin's work, but this is essentially what Handlin was talking about, was that, look, there's something distinct about the nature of American society, that it's a society, and its history, insofar as it has a history which begins, according to people like him, obviously, with the coming of the white man. There was no history before that, right? That insofar as there is a history, this is to be captured through immigration. Okay? So something is pulling these people, and something is pushing them. Something pushes them out of wherever they are, and then America pulls them. So that was the typical modality through which one studied the idea of an immigrant society. Okay? Now, from there we go on to a different conceptual framework. So we can look at it this way. We can say that, well, what we have here is something called departure. Okay? So if we're going to start looking at, let's say, diaspora, right? So we have something called departure. Then we have something called the middle passage. The middle passage is literally the passage, right? But it's more than literally the passage, right? Of course, nowadays a passage may not entail very much, literally, right? So you sit on a plane and you've got an immigrant visa, you arrive there and you get quizzed a little bit by the customs officer at LAX airport. Have you ever been to Afghanistan? If you have, well, probably you can't come in, but otherwise, okay. In my most recent entry to the US, I was asked by the immigration officer, sir, have you been to any part of the Middle East on this trip, including Pakistan and Afghanistan? And I thought, okay, I don't want to give this guy a lecture and tell him that Pakistan and Afghanistan are not part of the Middle East, because most likely he's going to detain me for 6 hours, if I tell him anything of that kind, right? But the middle passage back then could mean a long trip, right? You're coming on a ship, right? You may or may not survive. You know that if you know, by the way, the history of slavery, you know that 20% of the people didn't survive the middle passage, right? I mean, they died en route, and the bodies were just thrown into the sea. Now, indentured labor, not that bad, but still early 19th century, first part of the 19th century, you're talking about long journeys, okay? But it's not simply the physical journey. It's the journey that you undertake mentally, right? What happens during the course of that journey? How are you transported mentally to a different world? Is there a different horizon that you now have to think about, okay? And then from the middle passage, then we arrive at something called arrival, right? And there is a series of dislocations that are taking place. One dislocation is that you have been cut off from whatever you are moored to, right? Your familiar surroundings are no longer there. And this begins with the middle passage. And then it continues up till the time that you arrive. So there's going to be a series of dislocations. Those dislocations will continue, right? So you could look at it as a process of some kind, and there are going to be some transformations, right? And when we talk about arrival, then here again we can look at different strands. So one of them might be something that we call acculturation, for example, right? How does the immigrant adjust to his or her new society? And one of the things that, for example, somebody like Oscar Handlin never really thought about asking was, why is it that only the immigrant should adjust to his or her new society? Maybe that society that's there should also adjust to them, right? But nobody would really have thought of that. The idea was that it's a privilege to come to the US, so therefore you have to adjust to the US. Now, I think some people are beginning to contest that, right? And this is where you start getting into very convoluted terrain, such as cultural rights. That there are certain cultural practices that I'm familiar with from my culture, and when I come here, I bring those cultural practices with me, and they may not be agreeable to everybody over here, but maybe everybody needs to adjust to them. I'm not saying, by the way, that I'm proposing this as a solution. I'm not. I'm simply indicating to you a set of questions that one might want to ask about, okay? Then you might have transformation. So acculturation, then you might have transformation. There might be certain practices and certain institutions that might get transformed. Let me give you an illustration. Caste. Okay, not all of you will be familiar with caste. Some of you will be. So caste is a form of stratification in India. You know, it's different from class, right? So you're all familiar with the phenomenon of class, right? Upper class, middle class, lower class, and then within the upper there's upper, middle upper, lower upper, so forth and so on. And you know, there are ways to distinguish it, you know. If you have a Reader's Digest on your coffee table, well, it tells something about your class. And if you have Shakespeare, well, it's a little different, you know, okay, right? So, but class is a system of mobility. You move up and down. Right? You could be a beggar, and then you win the lottery, the Texas lottery, $10 million. Next day, you're really rich, right? Of course, that's not the usual form of mobility because, you know, obviously, by definition, only one person out of 100 million is going to win that lottery. Right? But we're saying there's mobility. The argument that used to be given by sociologists and anthropologists was that caste was a form of stratification that did not allow for mobility. Now, I don't think that that's an accurate assessment of what caste is, but let's provisionally accept it for the sake of argument, just to make things easier. So in India, and caste is a system that most people would argue, most scholars would argue, is distinct to India. Distinct to India. To the social systems of India. Right? And everybody is born into a caste. The caste is one way of determining your ancestral profession, your ancestral job. You know, even someone as famous as Palki Wala. I don't think anybody here would be familiar with him, but I'll write his name down just so that you understand what I'm trying to argue here. Palki Wala. So Palki Wala was the Indian ambassador to the United States in the mid-1970s. Now his name, to anybody who comes from India and who has some knowledge of these things, will know immediately what his ancestors did. Wala is a suffix. So if you say sabzi wala, it means the person who sells vegetables. Okay? Tel wala is somebody who sells oil. Palki is a palanquin. His ancestors carried a palanquin. So for example, a woman of very upper caste would travel in a palanquin. Right? And there would be 4 people, 2 in front, 2 in the back, and they would put their palanquin on their shoulders, and they would carry this aristocratic woman from point A to point B. Right? So that's what his ancestors did. You know from the caste what that person's ancestors would have done. Okay? Now, again, not the moment to get into the complexities of it. Why are we talking about this? Because the argument is that one of the things that happens in the diasporic context is that, especially in places like Trinidad and Fiji and Suriname, the importance of caste diminished. In fact, it disappeared, some would argue. Some would argue. Other scholars have a different view. But some scholars are quite clear in their mind that caste disappeared. That it didn't really... This was one advantage of going. That however strenuous the journey, however hellish your experience, wherever you went, you could escape your caste, your past. Right? That's one way to look at it. So, at the point of arrival, so to speak, then there might be different ways to understand what happens. I've given you 2 illustrations. One is the model of acculturation. The other is what we might describe as transformation. All right? Then over a period of time, when one is looking at these processes, the question will arise about the consolidation of the community. Yeah, initially, the numbers are going to be very small. Over time, the numbers are going to grow. When the numbers grow, certain institutions will develop. Good illustration, mosques and temples. 1965, hardly any temple in the United States, Hindu temple. Right? Hardly any. There was a couple, and there was a Gurdwara, by the way, in Stockton, which was built much, much earlier, right? Much earlier, because that's the early wave that I had spoken about. Right? And today, the US has, I mean, I haven't actually done a count, but at least 1,000 temples if not more. And some of them are the most gargantuan buildings you've ever seen, costing $50 million. Right? So if you live anywhere near Atlanta, and you go back home, all right, check out the Baptist Temple over there. I'll show you slides later on. Okay? Built at a cost of $50 million. Another Baptist Temple in Bartlett, about 50 miles from Chicago, approximately the same cost. Right? And these are now like major tourist sites. So the consolidation of the community, I'm giving you only one illustration of what the consolidation of the community entails. One could give hundreds of others, right? So consolidation of the community and some kind of social mobility, right? And we may ask, in continuation of this argument, a number of questions, such as, what kinds of transformations, right? That's a word that I'd use there. What kind of transformations one finds among those who have migrated, but also, to reiterate something I had said, but now in a slightly different context, what kind of transformations are to be found in the culture that receives them, right? So, for example, the manner in which Americans have opened themselves up to, let's say, Chinese food or Indian food. In Britain, it would be Indian food, more so than anything else. There are obviously transformations in the cuisine of the culture that's receiving these people. Right? The manner in which the English language gets altered, and so on and so forth. And then the final consideration within this process here, simply mention it for your consideration, and then again, we'll look at it in greater detail. What is the relationship of this diasporic populations to the motherland? Is there what the anthropologists, historians call the myth of the return? Do most people come with the expectation that they will go back? So if you speak to, for example, many Indians, let's say of my generation, the ones that I've spoken to, many of them said, we came here and we thought we would get a doctorate or something, and then we'd go back and serve the mother country. Well, they never went back, of course. Right? But there was this idea that you would return. Right? And now, in lieu of returning, since they're not going to return, the question is, how do they try to remain involved in the affairs of the motherland? Are they only remaining involved, or are they also trying to interfere with the relations of the motherland? Then you could look at it from the other point of view. How does India, in this case, since we're looking at the Indian diaspora, how does it seek to influence its diasporic population, particularly in the US? I would say quite bluntly that the Indian government, for example, 20 years ago, didn't have the remotest interest, frankly, although they couldn't say that openly, but they didn't have the remotest interest in what the Indians were doing in Fiji. The Indians were there in Fiji, but it's a small, poor country. What are they going to do for India? Now, the Indians here, it's a different story. A highly affluent, highly educated, in a position of being able to make investments, particularly when neoliberalization came in to India in 1991. So obviously India was thinking about improving, as they say, the investment climate. Right? That's a euphemism for saying let people come and just rape the country, frankly, usually. But let's improve the investment climate. Let's give good terms to GE and General Motors and Westinghouse and IBM and Microsoft, whatever the case might be. Let's give them really good terms. Let them come here, build a plant, right, etc., etc. Right? So obviously they had to court the Indians here. Right? So different relationship. And as I said, frankly, the Indian government didn't really care about the Indians in Fiji or Suriname. Of course, it would, rhetorically say that, it was alarmed at how they were being treated, right? And it found the behavior of the Fijian government towards the Indians intolerable, right? And it would ask for the expulsion of Fiji from an organization called the Commonwealth. Don't worry if you've never heard of it, because it's of absolutely no consequence except in the mind of the Indian government. The Commonwealth is basically is an organization to which the countries that were formerly under British colonial rule belong. And it frankly has absolutely zero clout in world politics, zero. Not an iota of difference has the Commonwealth made to anything, right? But when the Indians got thrown out of Uganda, you're going to hear about that later on. They got thrown out of Uganda, They got thrown out of Kenya. What did India do? It went to the Commonwealth, right? It's like saying, let me go to the UN and ask for a meeting of the General Assembly, which is a completely impotent body, by the way, because the only body that counts in the United Nations is something called the Security Council. Okay? And within that, the US is paramount, frankly, whether one likes it or not. But the General Assembly is just a rhetorical gesture on the part of the UN to please everybody and say, oh, one country, one vote, right? You know? So if you happen to be Fiji, you get one vote, just like the United States. Nobody really cares about the General Assembly, but they'll pass resolutions, you know, on everything. The most progressive, resolutions, you know, slavery should be abolished, sex trafficking should be abolished, women should be treated with absolute dignity, etc., etc., etc. You can think of 500 resolutions they've passed. And many of the countries that don't believe in any of this will, of course, mark yes on the resolution. Right? So you see the picture. Now the Commonwealth is that kind of organization. So what did India do when Uganda threw out the Indians? It went to the Commonwealth and said, expel Uganda from the Commonwealth. All right, so you can expel Uganda. What difference does it really make? So let's be very clear in our mind. You don't have to accept this. You can say, I take a very different view. I think India, you know, had the interests of Indians all over the world in its mind. You know, at heart, the Indian state regarded the Indians in Fiji and Trinidad and South Africa as equivalent to the Indians in the United States. Right? But frankly, there isn't a shred of evidence to support that argument. Not a shred of evidence. Right? So, very different relationship. I'm saying to you, the gist of it is that India had, with its diasporic populations, depending on which state one is speaking about. Right? Then, the third large framework. So one was the waves and streams of migration. Secondly, the sort of what I'm talking about, the conceptual themes or processes by which one understands the whole idea of mobility within the diaspora, right? The relationship with the country that receives them, the process by which Indians or any members of any diaspora become a diasporic group. Third consideration is Indian culture and the diaspora. I'm not going to say very much about that now because that is going to be the bulk of the course in a way, right? What new forms of culture developed in diasporic groups? Okay? Are there new hybrid forms of literature, music? Music would be the best illustration. You know, for those of you who are interested in I don't know if you've heard of chutney music, for example. Okay, so chutney music is a music that developed in Trinidad, right? And it's a kind of a hybrid form of music, right? So there you can see, if you look at the music of Trinidad, small country by the way, but incredibly rich in music. You know, calypso, right? I mean, the greatest calypsonians have come from a place like Trinidad. So what it did was it combined these forms. So some shades of, more than shades I would say, considerable amount of influence of African music in chutney music. You know, right? On the other hand, it's also true that some parts of the diaspora preserved certain cultural forms which were no longer really encountered in India. Something I had hinted at very briefly in my opening lecture, you know. But there was a book that was done very recently, about 10, 15 years ago, and it's on Bhojpuri music, okay, in Trinidad. The music of people who are Bhojpuri speakers, right, which is a language related to Hindi, in North India, from North India. So the people who come from, and I'll show you later on in the next lecture, you know, different parts of India and where these people started migrating from. But interesting thing is that what she was able to capture in this book, in her study of Bhojpuri music in Trinidad, was a music of which relatively few remnants are to be now found in India itself. That was the interesting thing. So on the one hand, you could have highly hybrid new forms. On the other hand, you could have forms of culture which in some respects are not to be found elsewhere, right? And on that score, I want to make one general argument, a critical argument actually, and that has to do with the relationship with the land that you have. Now, I mean land, I don't mean just country. Okay? The relationship with the land, because let's look at it this way. Let me make this point and then I'll conclude over here for today. If you look at the history of colonization in the modern world, it's Europeans going to the rest of the world. Going to Africa, going to India, okay, Latin America. So in Latin America, of course, it began with the Spaniards and then, right? And then obviously you're going to get later waves of Europeans. In India, you've got the British who established their supremacy, although the French and the Dutch had a presence as well in India. Even the Portuguese had a presence before either the English or the French or the Dutch. Right? In Indonesia, of course, it's going to be the Dutch, right? In Congo, it's going to be the Belgians, so forth and so on. I'm just giving you a few illustrations. Now, in all of these cases of colonization, there obviously is something that distinguishes them as well. And generally, scholars such as myself who study colonialism, I mean, they make a distinction very often between settler colonies and non-settler colonies. So, for example, America was a settler colony. When people from Britain came over, the idea was you were going to settle down. Right? This is a settler colony. Australia is a settler colony. Settler colonies were treated differently than non-settler colonies. All right? Very differently than non-settler colonies. Different forms of integration or non-integration, racism, all of that would have to be taken into account. The critical thing, however, is this, that everywhere that the Europeans went, they sought to transform the landscape. One way you seek to transform the landscape is you give it a new name. It's not as though the Native Americans didn't have names for the places where they were living, but the Europeans imposed their own names. New York, New Amsterdam, right? New Jersey. The word new here is telling too, by the way, you know, but it didn't have to be that way. Almost any name that you can think of, right? Even the naming of America. The naming of a place is to take possession of it. Right? So the first thing when you're born is you're given a name. Think of it, right? And you stick with that name for the rest of your life. Well, you might get a name change done or something. We're not going to look at, you know, some exceptions over there. But you stay with that name, right? So what I want to argue is this, that from the European standpoint, these places that they went to, particularly in countries such as Australia, where all they saw was a barren landscape, it didn't matter to them that there were Aboriginals living there who could see things that the white men could not see. And this is not some romantic imagination. There's plenty of work that's been done on these things, you know. And there's, by the way, a fantastic Australian film. If you've never seen it, see it. One of the really, really good films to have come out of anywhere in the last 15, 20 years, right? It's called The Tracker. And The Tracker is that, you know, they're using an Aboriginal. The film is set in Australia. There's an escaped prisoner. They want to track him down. But the problem is that when you've gone into the Australian outback, you're a white man, you can't see anything. All it looks like is just hundreds of miles of sand and pebbles maybe. But the Aboriginal can track things, can see song lines, as it were, that you cannot see. Right? That's why you have to get a tracker. They did that, by the way, in the US too. Native Americans were used as trackers. Okay? So they just saw this barren landscape. They thought there was nothing there, effectively. And what I'm saying is that they transformed place because people have an attachment to their land. And that is a quintessential part of the history of Native Americans. The attachment they had to their land, their specific land. It's not some generic space, it's a place. What the Europeans did was they transformed place, which is specific, which is local, into something generic called space. because that becomes the condition for colonialism. Now, in the case of the Indians, it's a reverse process, if I may say so, in the diaspora. That is that you're coming here, let's say you've come from a town or a city in India. Let's say you've come from Banaras. Let's take an example of a city that is considered to be the oldest living city in the world. The history of maybe 3,000 years or more. You've come from Banaras and you come, to Los Angeles, which frankly is going to look very generic because Burger King, McDonald's, Walmart, Costco, 90% of it seems to be 50 generic stores which you could find anywhere in the US, frankly. Right? So the labor is going to be to transform this generic space into your own place. Right? Reverse process. You transform it into your own specific place in a way. And I'm not saying, by the way, that in the European case, the Europeans didn't try to, of course, eventually they would try to make some places their own, which is why they built hill stations, which is why the English garden was the British tried to set up an English gardens wherever they went. Introduce some element of familiarity, right? Some elements of their own culture. But initially, they treated the entire landscape as a generic space. Okay? They eviscerated local histories. Completely eviscerated local histories. And what I'm saying to you is that, so place is going to be rendered into space. And here, what the Indians are going to do is they're going to try to, in some ways, create a notion of place for themselves. Right? This is one way to understand the nature of how communities come up. All right? So I'm going to stop over here and begin on a few general points in my next lecture and then immediately move into the question of indentured labor and its history.